Thank you, Lucy, for that introduction. And thank you all for joining in today. I'm going to be presenting some of the work that I did as part of my dissertation research. So to give you a brief overview of what to expect, I'm going to first give you a little bit of background. So really asking the question of why hair and heat load is an interesting topic in the context of human evolution, then going over the methods. And the methods are actually interesting because they involved a little bit of creativity and the use of some unusual equipment for anthropologists, at least. And of course, we're going to go into the results. And finally, I want to spend some time discussing what this all means and what some potential next steps are. So for some background, humans are weird. And we know this because a lot of what we do as evolutionary anthropologists is ask questions of what makes our species unique, what makes our species special, and these traits that we consider among the laundry list of traits that we consider important to human uniqueness and human evolution. I want to focus on one of them, which is our supposed hairlessness. So humans are sometimes referred to as naked apes. And while a lack of body fur does make us stand out from other apes and primates in general, having no body hair or having a lack of body hair, this apparent hairlessness, that's not really that unique among mammals. Most mammals are hairy, but there are naked mammals in the sea, naked mammals underground, and even naked mammals on the savannah. So in my view, what makes us unique is not really this hairlessness, but it's the combination of an apparently naked body and the retention of this tuft of hair on top of our heads. Thinking about the evolution of this phenotype that is so different, the key environmental factor that we want to think about here is solar radiation. Knowing that humans evolved in equatorial Africa, we know that the evolutionary environment that shaped human evolution, especially early human evolution, would have been one of high solar radiation. This is in line with a lot of the things that we know about skin color and the evolution of especially darker pigmentation. Knowing that humans lost their body hair, at some point, the skin would have really been the last barrier between humans and the sun. And thinking of UV radiation and how damaging it can be, melanin and an epidermis that's very pigmented would be a great source of protection. But UV radiation only makes up a small percentage of the total solar radiation that we get in our planet. A much larger proportion of it supplies us with thermal radiation or heat. And that's why we really have to think about thermoregulation here. I'm sure we're all aware that thermoregulation is important. And for humans, the range of body temperatures that we need to stay between is about 35 degrees Celsius to 42. And for the purposes of this presentation, we're interested in early human evolution, so we're more concerned with that upper threshold that might lead to hyperthermia. And thinking of the kinds of adaptations to heat we might expect, we already know that an important one is trading in a lot of these hair follicles for sweat glands. But is sweating really the silver bullet for thermoregulatory adaptations? I think that a lot of times we consider that it is, but when the hyperthermia we're considering isn't just caused by ambient temperature, but specifically from solar radiation, having sweat glands alone might not be enough to protect us from this effect. And that really explains why most mammals have fur, even in the savannah, even in the desert. It's because it offers a lot of protection from the sun. A coat of hair can reflect and absorb a lot of solar radiation before it actually reaches the skin. So in that context, I want to discuss some of Peter Wheeler's work. Wheeler's work is known for thermoregulation, and it's usually discussed in terms of its relevance to bipedalism. But one of the things that he discussed in his papers was the potential role for scalp hair in protecting humans from solar radiation. As bipeds, our heads really get the brunt of the solar radiation that comes down on us. So in one of his papers, one of the things that Wheeler did is look at the intensity of solar radiation throughout the day, noting that the highest radiation occurred really in the middle of the day when the sun was at its highest elevation. And scalp hair really only covers about 10% of our skin. So at face value, it might seem like it can't really offer that much protection. Why would having it just on our scalps really matter? But Wheeler looked into this and took into account the angle of the sun. And with that was able to calculate the percentage of skin that was shielded at different points of the day. And what he found is that because of our bipedal posture, scalp hair can effectively shield up to 40% of our exposed skin when the sun is at its highest peak. In 2014, Nina Jablonski and George Chapman took this hypothesis one step further and argued that tightly curled hair, as seen in a lot of African populations, might actually offer superior protection from solar radiation. There is this racist misconception that African hair is woolly, and like many misconceptions, that has led to misguided ideas, one of them being that because hair is woolly, it will be more insulating and actually a liability to overheating. But tightly coiled hair is nothing like densely packed wool. When you think of wool, it actually is more similar to straight hair in the sense that it packs together. And this ability to pack together causes it to not only insulate, but at the same time also reduce the amount of sunlight that comes through. But that then becomes a trade-off. So when you think of tightly coiled hair, it's different in the sense that that insulation isn't complete. There are all these air pockets that are in the hair, and that allows you to then minimize the amount of solar radiation that comes in, but maximize the amount of heat that you can lose through these air pockets. And that is partially because you're creating a larger distance between the surface of the hair and the surface of the scalp. Of course, it's one thing to offer some reasoning as to why it would be better protection, but another thing is to demonstrate that. So I worked with researchers at the University of Loughborough to carry out a number of experiments to test this hypothesis. Now for the methods. You might wonder, how does one test a hypothesis of insulating value for human scalp hair? And yes, measuring scalp temperature in people is an option. Measuring body temperature in people as they have different hairstyles is an option. There aren't a lot of studies that specifically look at hair and solar radiation as opposed to heat generated from movement, but there is one interesting study from 2011 that had people exercise in the sun with hair. And they took sweat and body temperatures, top temperature measurements, and then they repeated these experiments with those same people exercising in the sun with their hair shaved. Interestingly, what they found is that the only thing that differed between these two conditions, significantly, at least statistically significantly, was that there was a higher sweat rate in the no hair condition. And you should remember this because I'm going to refer to it later. Now, this study doesn't really tell us anything about hair variation. So clearly there's still work to be added here. And initially, I was planning on doing human trials, but working with live humans takes a lot of time and effort. And then COVID also happened. So I'm really glad that I went with the alternative approach, which is really to consider things from a biophysical perspective and ask questions about variation that isolate the heat transfer specifically from physiological responses to heat. What does that even mean? Well, it means that I used a thermal mannequin instead of using humans. I like to describe thermal mannequins as human-shaped robots that measure heat loss. These kinds of machines, this kind of equipment, is often used to test the insulation of clothing in climate-controlled chambers. In brief, a thermal mannequin uses electricity to keep itself or to keep its surface at a set temperature. If a piece of clothing is not very insulating, it will take the mannequin more energy to keep that surface temperature. On the other hand, if a piece of clothing is very insulating, it will take less energy for the mannequin to keep that body temperature. So this actually offers a really great way of being able to test what the heat transfer, what the potential for heat transfer is with different coverings. That doesn't just have to be clothing, but you could use human hair, for example. And we decided to use wigs. So I got 3 wigs that were made of human hair of Chinese origin, all 8 inches long. One was straight, one was artificially curled with large curls, and then the other was curled with tight curls. Now, because human hair morphology varies in a lot of different aspects between populations, restricting the origin of the hair to one population is some way of accounting for that, in the sense that we would hope that cross-sectional variation doesn't vary too much, the cuticles don't vary too much, and we're really only looking at that one aspect that we're trying to test, which is curvature. Now, you can't necessarily guarantee this because it's still human hair and there is variation, but when wigs are produced, hairs are actually chosen by similarity. So hairs are sorted so that you have hairs in a wig that are very similar to each other. And in that sense, actually, wigs have less variation than your average human head of hair. Why I specifically chose hair of Chinese origin and the details of this is a whole topic in and of itself, because the human hair market is very weird and a topic in and of itself. I'm not going to go into detail here, but if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. So what we were considering with these wigs is mainly this increase in curvature. You're going to see later on that I refer to the 3 different wigs as low curvature, mid curvature, and high curvature. So in terms of our variables, there were the human hair wigs, but we also ran the experiments without any hair, the so-called nude option. We also simulated solar radiation with floodlights, and we simulated a few different wind speeds to mimic the expected effect of a person standing still, a person walking, and running. Finally, we wanted to know, given humans' ability to sweat and given how important this is to our ability to cool down, what would evaporative cooling do? How would that affect all of these conditions? So we ran all of the experiments dry and then with the mannequin scalp soaked wet. We were able to take this raw experimental data and predict the heat loss for a temperature of 30 degrees Celsius. This was just a starting point, and knowing that a lot of places in equatorial Africa go above 46 degrees Celsius even, this is kind of a nice starting point that gives us a baseline of, well, this is a kind of minimum that we can consider, and any additional heat that you might get from solar radiation might exacerbate whatever we're finding here. We can't make those conclusions until we actually model for all of these temperatures, but I just wanted you to have that context. So what were our results? To briefly orient everyone, the different colors that you see here on the right corresponds to the different wigs that we used. And then on the x-axis, you have wind speed. On the y-axis, you have heat loss. So anything above 0 means we have heat loss. Anything below 0 means that we have heat gain. And in our scenario, we're looking for heat loss. So when we ran our experiments, without simulated solar radiation, we found that in the dry condition, there wasn't really a lot of difference related to hair morphology. But you can see that the nude scalp, the nude condition, seems like a clear winner in the sense that there's much more heat loss there. In the wet condition, this pattern was really exaggerated. And you would expect that in the wet condition, so adding evaporative cooling to the mix, either way, the heat loss would increase. What's interesting here is that as the wind speed increases, heat loss does increase in general, but it actually looks like tightly curled hair performs the worst, given that we're looking for heat loss. So how does this change when you add solar radiation into the mix? Now, initially, these results actually just all look bad because we're all in the heat loss zone, and that's at 30 degrees Celsius. So at 30 degrees Celsius, without adding evaporative cooling, all of the conditions almost really lead to this heat gain. And what's interesting here is that we see that the head without any hair, so the nude head, is performing the worst. Even though you can lose a lot of heat because you have no barrier, it looks like the net effect of gaining so much heat from solar radiation means that it's performing badly. And the only option that's really in heat balance, that's not gaining any heat and even losing a little bit of heat, is the tightly curled option. So we see here that solar radiation really changes things. The way that heat transfers because of radiation specifically, as opposed to ambient temperature, means that we have to consider different factors, it seems. And what happens when you then add this evaporative cooling into the mix? We actually get a reversal of this pattern. So we see again that the head that's performing the best is actually the nude head. So this disadvantage of too much heat gain, net heat gain from solar radiation, is compensated for by the nude scalp's superior ability to lose more heat by evaporative cooling. This makes sense because there's no barrier to that water evaporating from the scalp. But what does this mean for our hypothesis? Does it mean that scalp hair is actually not useful at all? Does it mean that tightly curled hair is actually a liability? Well, let's look at it in another way. Even though evaporative cooling turned the tables when solar radiation was on, we can consider what this means in a more realistic context, which is by translating this to the amount of sweat that is being evaporated. So there's two things we can look at. We can look at the maximum potential for sweat. So how much sweat could all these different conditions possibly evaporate maximum? And what we see in that case is that clearly nude is the winner. You can evaporate the most sweat without any hair. But sweat isn't exactly free. You don't have an unlimited amount of water, and thinking of early hunting hominins, you would also have the danger of being low in electrolytes, which you can lose when you're sweating. So what we find is that when you're asking the question of what is the minimum amount of sweat that is required to bring the head back to its heat balanced state, you see that the nude scalp actually requires much more sweat evaporation in order to reach that. And again, we see that the tightly curled hair requires the least amount of sweat, which is 0. What's also interesting and really nice here is that we see this gradation. So it's not just the two extremes, but we see that low curvature, which is the straight hair, and mid curvature are showing that pattern that we would want to see, which is increasing curvature leads to less requirement for sweat. So to just sum it all up, what these results show is that hair minimizes heat gain. And that is heat gain that comes specifically from solar radiation. We look at the difference between no hair on the scalp and hair. And in most cases, what we found is that having no hair meant that there's no barrier to heat loss. But when you think of solar, or when you look at solar radiation, that barrier becomes important because that barrier minimizes the amount of heat gained. So even though the nude scalp was capable of losing more heat, when you looked at it in terms of net heat gained, it had a disadvantage. And we also show that there's a clear pattern between higher hair curvature, lower solar heat gain, and a lower need for sweating to cool down. So putting this in context of other research and what kind of questions we should be asking now, I want to move forward talking more about the sweating. Sweating would have been important for early Homo, as this is the only form of cooling that humans really have available to them, especially when you're thinking about an increasingly large brain, which is thermosensitive, but also thermogenic. You really want to have the ability to cool down and keep that brain cool. And while some mammals have the ability to do localized cooling to the brain, we don't have that. In addition to that, water becomes important. And this is something that a lot of people have looked at and thought about in terms of early Homo. And this is a very interesting paper here that talks about dehydration and persistence hunting. So specifically when it comes to persistence hunting and endurance running, that is when we're going to be generating the most heat from our bodies, in addition to being out in the sun. So you can have the ability to protect yourself from solar heat radiation, but that's not possible when you have to do something like persistence hunting. And what becomes dangerous there as well is this dehydration. So this is what they look at here in Homo erectus. This is actually a really, really cool model that contains models within models, because there are a lot of different factors that you have to take into consideration. And without going into the details here, one thing that I want to zoom into is the assumptions that are made when we talk about hair. So one of the assumptions that they have here is, since we simulate running, which is a highly physically demanding activity associated with high rates of sweating, it can be expected that the hair will be wet during running. Is that really a fair assumption? So we see here that not only is there this assumption that the hair is going to be wet, but there is no mention of variation in hair morphology or how this affects anything. This idea that hair will be wet when there's sweat involved doesn't actually hold. If you think about it, sweat doesn't actually affect all hair the same. So here I was looking up sweating basketball players, which makes my internet search history really, really weird, but it gives you a little bit of a visual of what happens when you have different hair types that interact with sweat. Unfortunately, that's not something that we were able to test in our experiments. And part of this is because of the limitation of the hair that we have. Hair that is particularly thin, that's going to absorb a lot more water. Hair that is thicker isn't going to do that. So these are all considerations that we have to think of as we move forward, because when you're trying to lose heat through sweat, you need that sweat to evaporate. If the sweat is evaporating from your scalp, that's wonderful. You will get the heat loss that you're really needing and looking for. If your hair becomes saturated with sweat and the sweat is evaporating from your hair, that's not necessarily going to help in terms of cooling you down. Another thing to consider with sweat is we weren't able to look at this in our study, because when you have a mannequin, what we did is we soaked the scalp in water. So in addition to water not being equivalent to sweat, what you have to take into consideration is that sweat doesn't just saturate the scalp when you start overheating. It's something that happens gradually. And actually the ideal sweating condition is that you're evaporating the sweat as you're producing it. So you never actually have it dripping down, because that's not really physiologically efficient. Knowing that we weren't able to test all of these things, but we have a lead, one of the next things that I really wanted to do was to look at the genetic aspect of this question. Hair does not leave a trace in the fossil record, period. And there are very few examples of mummified hair that we can find, and not far back enough to really have a comment on early human evolution. So one way to get around that is to look at evolutionary genomics as a potential way to have insight into that. But unfortunately, we don't actually know very much about the genetic basis of different types of hair morphology. Previous studies have looked at hair morphology in genome-wide association studies. And even though these haven't been done on populations with a significant amount of African ancestry, it's possible that some of the same genetic variants that influence hair morphology in other populations also contributes to hair morphology variation seen in African populations and other populations that have very tightly curled hair. So as part of my dissertation, another thing that I did is I looked at a sample of admixed European African individuals and quantitatively measured the curvature of the hair. And what I found is that there were 24 SNPs that I was able to replicate there. And I want to focus on one of these SNPs specifically, which is RS310644, which doesn't mean anything to anyone. But what's interesting about this is that previous studies reported that the C allele here was associated with more curly hair. And that's the same replication that we found, or that's the same thing that we were able to replicate here. It's that C allele was associated with higher curvature. So putting it all together, we have these experimental results, and we have at least one SNP that we can look at here. And what do we see? We see that tightly curled hair is, that the allele that was found in association with tightly curled hair is seen more commonly across African populations, and it's at a lower frequency in non-African populations. That is what you would expect from the admixture study that we did. But what's really the bonus here is that we found that this C allele is also at a higher frequency in Melanesian populations. Now, I'm sure you've all seen Melanesians before. They also have very tightly curled hair, similar to a lot of African populations. And this is where it becomes interesting, because Melanesians are not more closely related to Africans than other non-African populations. So finding this C allele in this distantly related population makes us ask some questions about how and why tightly curled hair evolved. Is it something that was ancestral to all humans and then was lost in a lot of non-African populations? Or is it something that evolved through convergent evolution? The way that we tested this, you can't really answer these questions. You don't know whether that's something that was consistently important in any kind of high solar radiation environment, or it was just something that was important early on in human evolution. One of the ways that we can gain some insight into that is by looking at any kind of outgroups. So we know that in chimps, they also have this T allele that's associated with straight hair. What would be really interesting to look at is at Neanderthals and Denisovans, which I wasn't able to do, and see what is found there. Now, there are two questions that we can really look at here, one of them being the curvature and the other being hair. And there are a lot of different scenarios that need to be tested. Is it the case that having scalp hair in and of itself is already so beneficial that that is what was evolving in early humans? Or is it that having scalp hair wasn't enough, and even though it was marginal, this additional bonus of having tightly curled hair was really that important that it evolved in early Homo? Or was it the case that this is something that's particular to African populations and something that evolved again in Melanesian populations? There's a lot more experiments that need to be done, there's a lot more research that needs to be done and studies that need to be done to understand the genetic background of this and how all of these alleles are distributed across the world. But I think that what we see here is a nice first step to really make sure that we're asking these questions, because this is something that hasn't been considered as much as other phenotypic traits have been considered in human evolution before. Hair has always been discussed as, or has more often been discussed as, a trait that's relevant to sexual selection in terms of how attractive different hair types might be, or how attractive having longer hair might be. But I think it's time that we start to consider whether there could be some functional elements that have been ignored here. So just thinking about some closing thoughts here, one of the first things that we want to do is to replicate these experiments with a wider range of hair types. This is not only in terms of curvature, but this cross-section, like I was saying, especially when it comes to sweating, cross-section could become an important factor. If hair can be saturated with more sweat, is that something that then becomes a liability? And the flip side of the curvature and the cross sections from a hyperthermia perspective is, can hair actually protect us from losing too much heat from the scalp? There's one locus that's especially associated with the evolution of thicker hair in EDAR. And some people have suggested that thicker hair might have evolved in these East Asian populations to protect from this heat loss. This is something that's implied by the experiments that we've done, but it's not been explicitly tested. We would also want to consider the porosity of hair. So that's the extent to which the cuticle can open and absorb the water. We couldn't test this because, again, we have a very limited range of hair that's available here. And this is where having wigs is a difficult way to test these things, because the human hair market is predominantly saturated with East Asian hair and South Asian hair that people are able to collect and sell en masse. You can't actually find hair of African origin that's available to buy wigs from. So another way to look at that might be to actually produce different fibers that have different properties. And at the very least, one thing that we want to do is to understand what these results for hair really mean in the context of whole body cooling. Some of the people that I've talked to, including some of my committee members, have asked me to consider whether I actually think this would impact the whole body. A lot of times hair is sort of an afterthought because it covers such a small portion of the body. And that was the case in that paper that I showed on dehydration and persistence hunting. Overall, it's considered to be such a small part of the body that it's a small surface area, it can't possibly contribute much. But when we think about where that part of the body is, the head, and what it protects, the brain, could it then potentially become more important? Is thermoregulation something that we need to separate in terms of keeping an ideal body temperature and protecting the brain specifically from heat stroke or heat loss? If you think about the kind of advice that people get when they go out hiking or they go out in the sun, it's to cover their heads. This is something that hasn't necessarily been explored sufficiently. And these initial results that we're finding here, where actually having hair and having tightly curled hair reduces how much heat you gain, might have important implications for whether it's people who are athletes doing exercise or whether it's the military. They might have important implications for the kinds of advice that we need to be handing out to people. And in terms of the modeling, another thing that we can do is take these experimental results and then model those different hair types. Finally, what you want to do is to explore hair-related loci for their evolutionary history. Like I said, I gave an example of one specific allele where you have the ancestral variant in chimps and in most non-humans, but you would want to look at all hair-related genes in mass and see whether there is a pattern there in terms of hair-related genes that might be relevant specifically to curvature and morphology variation, as opposed to hair-related genes that are able to inform us about the loss of body hair and the retention of scalp hair. There's already some research that's been done on that, and there's a very interesting paper a few years ago that was looking at genes involved in the developmental biology of hair follicles and sweat glands. So they have a common developmental pathway, and it's possible to switch the cell fate of a group of cells from a hair follicle to a sweat gland. If we're able to understand more about that developmental biology, the developmental genetics behind that, we might be able to separate those two questions. And another way to look at that is to look at Neanderthals and Denisovans, like I said. So taking it all together, this is really a lot of preliminary research. Evolutionary anthropologists haven't really looked at hair. There have been some hypotheses and theories. So a lot of what Peter Wheeler did in the 80s is so valuable and so important to refer back to. But what we need to do now is to extend that research and really revive it. And a lot of that is going to take not only time, but it's also going to take collaboration with non-anthropologists, which is what I had to do for this for this research. So I'm gonna just round off now, and we can go to questions. And I just briefly wanted to acknowledge my advisors and the collaborators, my lab and the funders, and to just say thank you specifically to the University of Loughborough and George Havenith for letting me do these experiments, and James Smallcombe, who was the postdoc who helped me collect all of this data. And of course, Newton, who was the thermal mannequin that we used for these experiments. Thank you for your attention, and I'll be happy to answer any questions now.
Thank you, Tina. That was such a great talk, and yeah, really, really interesting research. If you want to stop sharing your screen, we'll go into the Q&A. So just a reminder as well to everybody about the poll. The link is in the chat. We'd be really grateful for everybody to fill that out. So we have already got a question from Eva. Great talk, thank you. A clarification question. On the slide with the minimum required sweat, were the differences between the wig groups statistically significant, or did some of them perform similarly?
So if I recall, I can think back to my dissertation, I think they were significant, or at least the difference between the high curvature and the low curvature was significant, but maybe not necessarily mid curvature to low curvature. Hair versus no hair was significant. Another issue actually answering that question is the small sample size. So the way that a lot of research is done in environmental ergonomics is not necessarily what we're used to, because I'm used to very large sample sizes and, specifically asking whether it's statistically significant, and we weren't really able to do that here. So yeah, without going into too much of a tangent, I can definitely tell you that at least nude was statistically significantly different from all the other hairs, and that the high curvature was different from low curvature.
So I've received a question via email. So it's about, rather than hair variation, it's about hair length. What is the evolutionary advantage of hair that continues to grow? And are we the only species that has this characteristic?
So that's also a very interesting and funny misconception. Some people say that human scalp hair grows forever, and to some people it might seem that way, but it doesn't. All hair on our bodies grows cyclically. So there's 3 parts to that cycle. There's the growth stage, resting stage, and the stage where the hair falls out of its follicle and a new follicle comes in its place. The difference between different types of hair on our body is how long that growth stage is. And from existing research, what they say about human scalp hair is that this growth phase can be anywhere from 2 years to 7 or 10 years at the maximum, but it doesn't really grow forever. And that is something that's exaggerated depending on the hair morphology that you're looking at. A lot of times people ask me whether East Asian hair or European hair is different in the sense that it grows forever, and then African hair doesn't grow as long and it's inherently shorter. That's not necessarily the case. There's so many factors playing into that, and one of them is the ability to retain that hair. So if you have hair that's very fragile and it's tightly curled, you're going to be doing so many things to manipulate that hair that it might break a lot more commonly and more easily. And another part to that question is, how might having longer hair, even if it doesn't grow forever, be useful? And in that sense, I would say that combined with having tightly curled hair is where it makes the most sense to me. But this is all speculation. Having longer, tightly curled hair actually means that you have bigger hair, right? So we've all seen afros. And one of the things that I find really funny reading back through this older literature is either Peter Wheeler or someone responding to Peter Wheeler saying, oh, well, if it's so important to protect ourselves from, this angle where the sun is at its highest, why don't we grow hair on our shoulders? And if you think about it, if you have straight hair, you're right. It's only going to cover the skin that it covers. But if you have big hair, and thinking some of you might have seen some of the pictures of indigenous people in Papua with the kinds of hairstyles that they have, it literally does cover your shoulders. So maybe that's part of the reason that evolved. And it might be something as simple as longer hair that's tightly curled creates more space between the scalp and the top of the hair surface.
So there's another question in the chat. Is there any advantage for becoming partially bald?
I'm going to assume that that's in evolutionary context or just in general. I mean, look, you're going to spend a lot less on hair care products. So I feel like a financial advantage is an evolutionary advantage right there. But other than that, from an evolutionary perspective, assuming that it happens as we age and it happens after peak reproduction, it's not going to have much of an effect. From the results that I have currently, I was really I guess I wasn't surprised. I don't know what I would have expected, but there is this idea of, if you are somewhere hot, do you want a bunch of hair covering you? Like, I would say the answer is obviously no. But seeing that solar radiation as opposed to ambient heat changes things, I would say that you would want to be as naked as possible, as hairless as possible, in a place that is very hot, but maybe not necessarily has a lot of solar radiation. So thinking about the Amazon, I have been to a rainforest once, and once is enough for me. I have so much respect for anyone who does field work, but you cannot breathe there. It is so humid, and you can't evaporate sweat. There's no point. You can't. That's not going to cool you down. And the source of heat isn't the sun. So in that sense, I would say that is a really good place where you might want to be bald throughout your whole body.
So there's a really nice comment in the chat. Splendid lecture, the most comprehensive I've ever heard about head hair. Good luck with your future studies.
Thank you.
We do have time for more questions if anybody does have another question for Tina. You can also raise your hand if you want to ask out loud. But
hats. I saw that one. So hats, yes. That's actually something that I would say is really, really important. In terms of cultural behavioral adaptations, that's one of the things that makes the most sense. I think that's one of the things that makes it really hard to make any even speculative statements about when hair would have been important. So skin and skin color, it's not until recently that we had things like sunscreen. But when it comes to reducing heat and something that's so obvious. So let's say you're thinking about the danger of UV and how that might damage folate in the bloodstream. If you're walking around, you don't notice when your folate is being destroyed. At least I don't. So that's not something you can respond to or would even think to respond to. In that sense, having this evolutionary, physiological mechanism evolve makes sense. But when it comes to heat, you know, that is the first thing you're going to respond to culturally, behaviorally. You're going to seek shade. Even animals do this. You're going to have hats, parasols, perhaps, who knows? And that's why thinking of when it would have been an evolutionary adaptation makes it really hard. When I started off this work, I was convinced that, all of this would have happened in early Homo. It's the only thing that makes sense. But now, especially looking at some of the genetic work, I'm wondering whether some of these things might be derived in African populations. We don't really know that. And, things like hats really throw a wrench in the whole thing.
Okay, so I guess we can call it a day there. Thank you very much, Tina, for such a great talk and discussion. And thank you, everybody, for coming along today. And we'll see you next week.